Greetings fellow guitar travellers, it's Rowan J Parker here and welcome to another episode of Music Theory 101. And this week's episode is delving into the diminished 7th chord. We're going to be covering this chord in quite some depth because it's very interesting. We're going to be looking at where it comes from, how it's constructed, how to use it, chord progressions, chord substitutions, and finally a concept called the Diminished Gateway, which we'll find out all about. Should be very interesting. Before we get into today's lesson, I'd like to encourage you to have a look at my website, www.rowanjparker.com. Tons of cool guitar material on that site, almost all completely free, though there is a store where you can buy things. There is free lessons, there's backing tracks you can play over. If you subscribe to the website, just by sticking out your email address into the subscribe box, you get access to even more free lessons and all the tablature for my YouTube lessons. So please do have a look and sign up, subscribe, and if you feel so inclined, help me out, support me financially and buy something from the store. Alright, so enough of that, let's get straight on to today's lesson, Music Theory 101, the diminished 7th chord. Let's rock! Now, if you cast your minds back to the last episode of Music Theory 101, we discovered that a diminished 7th chord is the chord that is constructed built upon the 7th degree of a harmonic minor scale. So for instance, in the key of C harmonic minor, the 7th chord of the key of C harmonic minor would be a B diminished 7th chord. So that's where the diminished 7th chord comes from. It's a product of harmonic minor scale harmony. However, there are some quite interesting things about the diminished 7th chord, unique things in fact. So let's go ahead and look at the notes that are contained in this B diminished 7th chord. The root note is B, and then we have D, and then we have F, and then we have G sharp, or A flat, we could spell it that way. The intervallic construction of the chord is this: it's root, minor third, diminished 5th, and diminished 7th. Or in jazz nomenclature, 1, flat 3, flat 5, double flat 7. Now the interesting thing about all the notes in this chord is, if you were to arrange them all on a single string and just observe the interval between each note, this is what you'd end up with. The interval of B to D is a minor third. And the interval from D to F, which is the next chord tone, is also a minor third. And then the interval between F and G sharp, between the flat 5 and the diminished 7th, is also a minor third. And then the interval between the double flat 7th or diminished 7th and the root is another minor third. So to put it this way, the distance between every note in the chord is the same. It's an equal distance of a minor third. And because of this, no particular note in the chord sounds like the root. Any one of the notes in the chord could be construed as a root, and therefore the chord will just tend to invert and be the same chord. So let me try and clarify that a little bit. If we play a B diminished 7th chord and we look at the notes that are in this particular voicing, we have B, F, G sharp and D. Now if we move this voicing up 3 semitones, 3 frets, a minor third, we've got a D diminished 7th chord. Now let's look at the notes in this voicing. We have D, G sharp, B and F. So i.e. exactly the same 4 notes, albeit in a different order. And then we move up another minor third, 3 frets. We'll have F diminished 7th, and here we have F, B, D and G sharp. So again you can see it's the same 4 notes. And then one more minor third, G sharp diminished 7th, G sharp, D, F and B. So once again the same 4 notes, and if we invert again, we just get B diminished 7th chord at the octave, back to where we started. We'll have B, F, G sharp and D. So you can clearly see it's the same 4 notes in every chord. So actually, here's the interesting thing. One diminished 7th chord isn't one diminished 7th chord, it is in fact 4 different diminished 7th chords. B diminished could be considered as B diminished 7th, or D diminished 7th, or F diminished 7th, or G sharp diminished 7th. Alright, so one diminished 7th chord is actually 4 different diminished 7th chords. Alright, so far so good. So how many diminished 7th chords are there in total? Well, usually there are 12 keys. There are 12 keys of everything. 12 major scales, 12 minor scales, 12 major chords, 12 minor chords, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. But we've seen that one diminished 7th chord equals 4 different diminished chords. So how many different diminished 7th chords are there? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that 3 times 4 equals 12. So the total number of different diminished 7th chords is actually only 3, because we have B and all its inversions. Then we have C diminished 7th and all of its inversions. And then we'll have D flat diminished 7th chord and all of its inversions. So there are only 3 different sorts of diminished 7th chord. So I hope that's clear enough and you can understand where the diminished 7th chord comes from and how it's actually constructed and how it inverts. Right, so now we know a little bit about the diminished 7th chord, let's look at how it functions harmonically. Now, diminished 7th chords have the same function as a dominant chord, and you can substitute a diminished 7th chord for a dominant chord. Let me just give you an example. In the key of C harmonic minor, the dominant chord, the 5th chord, would be G major or G7. And a perfect cadence in this key would be, say, G7 resolving to C minor. If we apply our chord substitution and use the 7th degree of the C harmonic minor scale, which will be a B diminished 7th chord, we can put the B diminished 7th chord in place of the G7 chord. And so we'll get B diminished 7th resolving to C minor. And it is the same harmonic function, it is basically a 5-2-1 perfect cadence. So to try and understand a little bit better what's going on, we should really look at the notes in the G7 chord and then look at the notes in the B diminished 7th chord and compare the two and just see what's different and what's the same, so we can try and understand why harmonically it performs the same function as a dominant chord. Alright, so let's have a little look at our G7 chord. G7 is G, B, D and F, and intervallically this is root, major third, perfect 5th and minor 7, or for you jazzers out there it's 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Now looking at the notes of a B diminished 7th chord, we have B, D, F and G sharp. So it'll probably occur to you almost immediately that that's almost like a G7 arpeggio. In fact, the only note that's different is that instead of having a G note, which would be the root of the G7 arpeggio, we have a G sharp, which is enharmonically a minor second, flat second, or flatted ninth, minor ninth interval. So here's the harmonic effect of doing this substitution. When you substitute the diminished 7th chord on top of the dominant chord or in place of the dominant chord, you're creating the sound or implying the sound of G7 flat 9, because that is the sound that you would actually get. If you look at intervals, you would have B, which would be the major third, then D, which would be the perfect 5th, F, which would be the flattened 7th or minor 7th, and then G sharp, which would be the flattened 2nd or flatted 9th, minor 9th interval. So that's why it works. So the thing to try and take away from this is that the function of the 5 chord and the function of the 7th chord, diminished 7th chord, and the key is basically the same. So 5-1, G7 to C minor, is much the same as 7-1. B diminished 7th to C minor, and we can use that substitution whenever we have a dominant chord. So let's just put it into a different key just to try and make it a bit more clear. I'll give you another example. If we're in the key of A minor, the 5th chord of the key of A minor would be E major or E7. Now what is the 7th degree of A harmonic minor? Well, it would be a G sharp diminished 7th. So the G sharp diminished 7th chord would substitute for the E7, again creating a strong perfect cadence in that key. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and show you a couple of chord progressions featuring the diminished 7th chord in this substitute role. It's performing what's called a 7 flat 9 substitution. So here we go, let's have a look at these jazz chord progressions where we're applying this substitution. Okay, let's place this chord substitution in a very common jazz chord progression called a 1-6-2-5. And all a 1-6-2-5 is the 1st, 6th, 2nd and 5th chord of whatever key you happen to be in. So in the key of G major, diatonic 1-6-2-5 would be G major 7, E minor 7, A minor 7 and D7. Now for this little exercise, I'm going to change the quality of the E minor 7 to E7th. And I'll leave the quality of the A minor 7 and D7 as is. Alright, so changing the quality of the 6th chord from minor 7 to dominant 7. So here's where we can play some of our 7 flat 9 or diminished 7th chord substitutions. I'm going to leave the G7 as is, but I'm going to employ a substitution on the E7. I'll leave the A minor 7 as is, and I'll employ a substitution on the D7. Now, here is another very quick and easy way of applying substitutions. If you want to substitute your dominant chord, all you need to do is play the diminished 7th chord one semitone above the root. So, the diminished 7th chord that will substitute for E7 would be F diminished 7th or any of its inversions. F diminished 7th chord, G sharp diminished 7th chord, B diminished 7th chord, and D diminished 7th chord will all substitute for the chord of E7. So in that case, the substitution I'm actually going to use is I'm going to use a G sharp diminished 7th chord to substitute for my E7. Progressing on to the A minor 7 chord, we're just going to leave that one alone. I'll leave that as is. And then for the D7 chord, we'll have D7 and then we'll use our diminished 7th chord substitution. So I'm going to move up again, moving up one semitone. That'll be E flat diminished, and then we can invert that if we like. G flat diminished. So our little chord progression becomes, well, this is what it started out as. It started out as G major 7, E7, A minor 7, D7. Now with a bit of diminished 7th chord substitution magic, it's become G major 7, G sharp diminished 7, A minor 7, D7, E flat diminished 7th, G flat diminished 7th, and then back to G major 7. So to put that in a little bit of rhythmic context, let's have a listen. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I think you can see that adds a little bit of interest and colour into the chord progression. So here's a little rule we can extract. Any dominant chord can be substituted with a diminished 7th chord whose root lies a semitone above that of the dominant chord. So very simply, E7th can be substituted with F diminished 7th or any of its inversions. Let's pick another dominant chord at random. How about C7? C7 can be substituted with C sharp or D flat diminished 7th or any of its inversions. And that's how 7 flat 9 substitution works. You hear it all over the place in jazz and in fusion, and you also hear it in things like flamenco music, where it's a very strong part of their harmonic vocabulary as well. Okay, so that's us covered chord substitution, 7 flat 9 chord substitution. We're now going to get into the most interesting part of the lesson, which is called the diminished gateway. So let's do that. So we've discovered that diminished 7th chords have a great tendency to resolve up a semitone where they will sound complete and at rest. So for instance, B diminished 7th will resolve very happily to C minor. But if you think about this a little bit more carefully, because the B diminished 7th chord is substituting for G7, it will actually just as happily resolve to C major, or C major 7, or even C7 for that matter. It doesn't really care too much. It will resolve up a semitone to a minor chord, to a major chord, or to indeed another dominant 7th chord. So that means from our diminished 7th chord, or B diminished 7th chord, we could gain access to two keys. We could gain access to the key of C minor, or we could also gain access to the key of C major. Alright, so far so good. But then what would happen if we inverted the diminished 7th chord 1 minor third, 1 inversion? We'd now be on D diminished 7th chord. And if we regard that as being the 7th degree now and resolving up a semitone, let's look at the chords or keys we could access in that way. D diminished 7th chord would resolve up a semitone to E flat minor, or for that matter, E flat major. So now we've got 4 keys we can access. We could access C minor, C major, E flat major, E flat minor, right? 4 keys. But that's not the end of it, because we know we can invert the diminished 7th chord again. And this time if we invert it again, we'll get F diminished 7th. And I think you can guess which chords or keys it can now resolve to. F diminished 7th chord will resolve quite happily to G flat major or G flat minor. Alright? And then if we invert one final time to G sharp diminished, then we know that that will resolve up a semitone either to A major or A minor. So this is the concept of the diminished gateway. We can take one diminished 7th chord, and by using the inversions of the diminished 7th chord, we can access in total 8 different keys. And we can access keys which are extremely remote, they're not close to each other at all. For instance, can you imagine trying to smoothly change or modulate between, say, C major and F sharp minor? The answer to that is usually no, because they're not close. They're in fact very distant chords. Or trying to modulate between, say, the key of A minor and C minor and make it sound incredibly smooth. Usually it's not possible, it's far too abrupt because these chords are not related, these keys are not related. However, using the diminished gateway concept, we can make the modulation very smooth and really imperceptible. It doesn't even sound like you've changed key, even though you have made a major change of key. So I'm just going to give you a couple of demonstration chord progressions applying this diminished gateway concept, and you can see how it's going to work. So here's a little example modulating from A minor to C minor. Right. Have a listen. 1, 2, 3, 4. Very interesting, yeah? Because we managed to get very smoothly between the two keys and it didn't sound random or abrupt. So let me just analyse this chord progression a little bit for you so you can see exactly what I did. First chord was A minor, and then we moved to D minor, which is the 4th chord of the key of A minor. And then we moved to E7, which is the 5th chord of A minor. So far, very straightforward. Chord 1, progressing to chord 4, progressing to chord 5. At this point I introduced my 7 flat 9 or diminished 7th substitute. So a semitone above the root, the dominant chord, I added the diminished 7th chord, F diminished 7th, and then inverted it in stages up to G sharp diminished 7th chord, then up to B diminished 7th chord, and then using the B diminished 7th chord, or regarding that now as the 7th degree, modulating up a semitone into the new key, C minor, and it sounded very smooth. You just play the chords separately and listen again, you see it does sound incredibly smooth. A minor, D minor, E7, F diminished 7th, G sharp diminished 7th chord, B diminished 7th chord, and then new key C minor. You see, it doesn't even sound like a key change, even though it is a radical key change from A minor to C minor. So when you start thinking about this concept, you can see that you can get to extremely remote keys very smoothly just using the diminished 7th chord as a transition. So to really apply this in your own playing, I suggest you compose a couple of little ideas and try and come up with something that uses this concept. It's the best way of understanding how it works. Okay, well, that is a mountain of theory for diminished 7th chords, very in-depth, and I know that some of you are probably sitting there with the brain leaking out of the ears thinking this is all far too much. So I suggest you watch the video a couple of times. It should become quite clear exactly how this works. It's really quite straightforward and logical. You just need to get to grips with the whole concept of chord scale relations and how the diminished chords invert. Alright, just going to do the wrap up now. Well, that concludes another episode of Music Theory 101. Hope you enjoyed it, found it useful, and you're starting to grasp exactly how these diminished 7th chords work. Really not so difficult to understand once you really get your head around it. But anyway, so I'd like to encourage you to have a look at my website one more time. You can book Skype lessons through the website as well. Just click on the book lessons link and follow the instructions and I'll get right back to you. Other ways of getting my stuff, there's lots of free backing tracks on SoundCloud. That's Rowan-Parker on SoundCloud. I'm on Facebook page you can like if you like, which is Rowan J. Parker. I'm also on Twitter if you want to do that, but I really detest Twitter, so I wouldn't bother. Yeah, and of course the YouTube channel's got tons and tons of free videos, so check them all out. Alright, that'll do for this week. Next week I fancy, well, I'll have to see what we're going to do next week. It might be something about augmented chords, and it might be something completely different. We'll have to wait and see. That's the fun of it. Alright, till then, farewell.